Hi guys, how are you? My name is Bruno, and today here on Big View Workshop, we are with Doug Noll. He's going to teach us how to calm down someone in 9 seconds or less. Okay? Leave here in the comments the country that you are in now, the city, and if you're a Big View user or not. Now, the stage is yours. Doug is with you. Good luck.
Thank you, Bruno. Uh, Welcome, everybody. My name is Doug Noll. By way of background, I am a lawyer turned peacemaker, and I've been studying human conflict for decades. And I have developed some very effective tools for calming down angry people that I'm going to share with you today. We've got, there we go, holistic dog training from Oregon. Yeah, I'm in California. So all of you who are watching probably on YouTube or wherever you're watching this stream, feel free to ask questions, put questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer them as we go along. And we will have time at the end to answer questions. I want to give you my email address so that if you have questions you want to direct to me after the presentation, you can do that. My email address is Doug, D-O-U-G, at dougnoll.com. And at the end of the webinar, I will be giving you a link for this particular audience, everybody watching on Big View, and you'll be able to download many more resources about what I'm talking about today if you find that is interesting. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Bruno, kick me over to the screen. There we go. And I'm in the bottom, and everybody should be able to see this. So what is this about? You are going to learn today how to calm any angry person in 90 seconds or less. And this is what I have determined to be a foundational skill of life. And if you do the practices that I will show you, that we'll get to eventually, you will see some really amazing results. I've taught thousands of people how to do this, people ranging from murderers in prisons to senior analysts at the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, how to use these skills, and everybody in between. And it works, it's powerful, and I'll warn you that it's not like anything you've ever seen before, because it's all based on neuroscience, not on psychology. So let's start at 50,000 feet. And I want to orient you to why dealing with emotions is so difficult for people until you learn these skills. And that is because for 4,000 years, philosophers and theologians have been telling us that what makes us different from other human beings is the fact that we're rational. So, for example, Plato saw reason and emotion as two horses pulling on a chariot in different directions. And the whole idea here, somebody says they can't hear me. I see the audio working here. Turn up your volume and make sure you got yourself plugged in. So Plato saw emotion as two horses pulling a chariot in different directions while the charioteers struggled to get them to work as a team. And so he's using the idea of somebody guiding a chariot as a metaphor for how our mental struggle is to control our emotions. And Aristotle asked or said, he asked the question, what distinguishes human beings as a species from other animals? And his answer was, humans are rational. And it is true that we have the capacity for reason. We can. I'm not sure we can be rational. That's a whole another subject to one of the graduate courses I teach. But certainly we have a capacity for reason. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher in the 17th century, wrote that emotions are bad and rationality is good. And the reason for all of this is because until the advent of neuroscience and understanding really what's going on inside of our brains, all of these philosophers saw nothing but bad things happen from people who were emotional. They lost control, they got angry, they did stupid stuff, they made bad decisions. And so emotions got a really bad rap for a long time. And the ideal for human nature was to be rational. But we have new knowledge now. A new insight only developed in the last 20 years. And here's the insight as it's described by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio. And that is that we are not rational beings. In fact, we are 98% emotional and only 2% rational. And once you get this insight, everything changes, because what formerly looked chaotic and crazy to you now makes perfect sense. So today what we're going to do is turn Western philosophy on its head, and we're going to say that there is no such thing as rationality. And in fact, many neuroscientists will tell you that. And if you look at economics, for example, you'll now find that in economics, people are talking about bounded rationality. Rationality can only occur in a certain narrow band of experience. And once you get outside of that band, people act emotionally. And in fact, all decisions that we make are emotional decisions. And you can't even be rational unless you're emotional first, because emotions make us pay attention to our environment. We'll be talking more about what emotions are and what they aren't in a few minutes. Here's a great quote from Albert Einstein that really, to me, proves the point. I never made one of my discoveries through the process of rational thinking. So rational thinking doesn't create new stuff. What it does is help to explain what already exists. We really need a different kind of process, an emotional process, a creative process, which is not based on rational thinking to create. And even Einstein recognized this. So why is this? And what are the problems that result from the fact that we emphasize rationality over emotions? Well, it turns out that we are generally very good at solving problems, but we're not always so good at relationships. We can get by with relationships, but we're not nearly as good at teaching about relationships and teaching about emotions as we are about learning how to solve problems. And that's because there are two systems in our brain. The first system is called the task-focus system, and the second is called the social system. These are two independent neural networks in our brains, and they operate independently of each other. When one is on, the other is off. You cannot be task-focused and be social at the same time. You cannot be social and solve a problem at the same time. It turns out that we're able to flip back and forth between these systems pretty quickly, but they are independent systems that operate exclusively when they are on. So education trains the task-focused system. So when we think about formal education, starting even in preschool, we're getting knowledge. We're gaining knowledge through knowledge acquisition. We are learning rules and procedures and algorithms. We're learning critical thinking processes. All of this is very important. We're learning how to reason. We're learning about logic, inductive and deductive logic. We're learning about probability analysis. We're learning about quantitative and qualitative analysis, and we're learning about the scientific method. These are all things that we learn that train the task-focused system of our brain, and this is what modern education is primarily designed to do. But we're not taught skills that strengthen our social system. So for example, we're not taught the skill of empathy. Well, you're going to learn empathy today. You're going to learn exactly how to do it and what it is. But this is not taught to us. We are not taught about emotions. Most people can't even define what an emotion is. We're not taught how to listen or what to listen for. You're going to learn how to do that today. You're not learning how to reflect to demonstrate that you understand from the speaker's frame of reference. We'll be learning how to do that today too. You certainly don't learn how to calm other people down, and there is a very specific set of skills that you have to learn to do that, and that's what we'll be learning later today. We're not taught emotional intelligence. We're not taught to be emotionally self-aware. And somebody mentioned traumas. We're not taught how to reprogram all of those childhood triggers and traumas that occur to everybody because parents, I'm going to make a fairly bold statement here, but I will support it. Parents, even the most loving parents, deeply abuse their children emotionally through a process known as emotional invalidation that we'll get to in just a moment. So what are some of the common strategies for dealing with strong emotions? There are basically 4 strategies that we all have relied on. None of them work. So we have emotional invalidation. This is the most insidious, pervasive form of abuse that exists. Everybody does it. It happens everywhere, and yet nobody knows how abusive this is because we just never not have the knowledge. So we've got this little girl, and she's obviously sad, depressed, and upset. And what is it that we're likely to tell her? Her parents or caregivers are going to say stuff like, it's not that big a deal. There's no reason to cry. But I do listen to you. You're not being rational. Imagine saying that to a 3 or 4-year-old. People do it, though. Don't be sad, telling her not to feel what she's feeling. You're way too emotional, judging and criticizing and blaming her for expressing her natural emotions. It can't be that bad, diminishing her emotional response. Get over it, telling her to not be emotional. You'll be okay. Don't be such a drama queen. Very judgmental, critical. Stop crying. So, for all of you who are watching, I want you to put a 1 in the chat box if any statements like this have ever been made to you. Go ahead, put a 1 in the chat box. Let's just see how common this really is. There we go. We got a couple of people. Right. And how does it feel when you are emotionally invalidated? You're having strong emotions and somebody says something like this to you, maybe even somebody very close to you. Just write in one word. What's it make you feel like? One word, the dominant feeling. And we'll see words like, it makes me feel angry. It hurts me. I don't feel like I'm being listened to. I don't feel respected. I feel dismissed. I feel ignored. I don't feel heard. Nobody enjoys being emotionally invalidated. Yes, I feel small. I feel like shit. Exactly. But now let me ask you a question. You know that it really hurts when you're invalidated. How many times have you invalidated somebody else, especially maybe a child? How many times have you done it yourself? And you'll find that if you think about it, you've done it a lot. And the question is, why do we emotionally invalidate? We know it hurts when we're invalidated, and yet we automatically tend to invalidate other people, especially children, when they're emotional. And what's going on here? Well, there are 3 reasons why we invalidate, even though we know it's very hurtful to ourselves when it's done to us. Number 1, we don't know any better. Number 2, it's what our parents taught us. And number 3, and this is the most important point, we are unconsciously soothing our own anxiety around another person's emotions. What that means is when people are emotional, it triggers within us an unconscious anxiety because we don't know what this person is going to do. And human beings will run from anxiety. It's the worst experience that we can have as a human being. And so in order to get rid of our anxiety, we're going to tell the other person not to feel what they're feeling, so that if they stop feeling what they're feeling, they stop having an emotional experience, I will feel better. So it's all about self-soothing one's own anxieties. And this turns out to be a major problem. The reason that we can't calm people down is because we are so busy trying to soothe our own anxiety. So emotional invalidation is number 1. The second way that we deal with people is problem solving. And let's see if this will come up. Yes, no, where is it? All right, we'll just keep going. Jumping to problem solving. How many of you have been angry or upset or emotional and somebody jumped in and said, hey, well, if you just did this, this, and this, and this, you'd fix the problem? Put a 1 in the box if you've ever had that problem, if you've ever had that done to you, where people have tried to solve your problem for you and you haven't asked for advice. Ever happen? And then think about how many times you have tried to solve somebody else's problem when they've been upset or emotional, where you said something like, well, if you just do X, Y, and Z, or all of this, then of course you'll fix the problem. problem solving is exactly like emotional invalidation. People jump to problem solving in order to soothe their own anxiety around the emotions of another. And of course, all it does is make things worse. And we know that because people have tried to solve our problems. We didn't want them to solve our problems. We didn't ask for advice. What we want is we want to be heard at a very deep level. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But problem solving, early problem solving, only makes problems worse with emotional people. How about this situation? Anybody ever seen this before? Shutting down. We got mom and her teenage daughter. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is that this daughter is emotionally unsafe. She's probably been emotionally unsafe for her whole life. Most people are. 96% of families are emotionally dysfunctional and are emotionally toxic places. That's from Virginia Satir, a very famous psychologist and therapist from the 1970s and 80s. That was her conclusion based on years of research. So if we are in a toxic environment, even though it seems like a normal, loving home, what do? We tend to go inside ourselves. We build up walls. We become emotionally unavailable. We emotionally shut down, and we don't let anybody inside to see us. So who we really are. We put on a big front outside that we're tough and strong and capable and confident. But inside, we are suffering because we're all alone, and we have a lot of painful experience that we've never processed before. And in order to avoid the pain of that process, we shut down, and you get this kind of situation. And then the fourth problem, of course, is the most obvious of all, is where somebody is in your face yelling and screaming at you. And we can have two basic responses to this kind of behavior. One is to become defensive. So we'll try to appease or rationalize or justify or excuse or even apologize, trying to get this person to calm down. And I will tell you right now, and it's probably been your experience too, that the worst thing you can do to an angry person is appease, justify, explain, rationalize, justify, or even apologize. All it does is make that angry person even angrier. And there are a whole bunch of reasons why in our central nervous system and brain why that happens. It all involves what's known as the polyvagal system, way beyond the scope of today's talk. But just know that if you try to appease or justify or excuse to an angry person, a boss or parent or friend or colleague or spouse, all you're going to see is more anger. And then the other way people can respond is by becoming aggressive themselves, which of course in the prison work that I do, this is where we see violence arising out of people who get in each other's faces, and before you know it, the knives are out and blood is on the floor. So these are the four most common ways that we unconsciously deal with conflict. And none of them work. And they never have worked, and they never will work. They just make things worse. So the question becomes, what does work? And that's where we're going to start moving into the new science and explain how all of this works. You're asking somebody, I'm watching the chat up here. If you're wondering who I am, my name is Doug Noll. And you can Google me and find out more about me than you ever want to know. Okay, so neuroscience tells us that emotions dominate rationality, that the essential human nature is to be emotional, not to be rational. So what are emotions? We better have a pretty good definition of this if we're going to understand what emotions are. Emotions are biologically based patterns of perception, experience, physiology, action, and communication that are culturally created in our brains. This comes from neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's a professor of neuroscience and psychology at Northeastern University in Boston, a brilliant woman. She's been very influential in my thinking about all of this. A couple of really important points that come from this definition. Number one, we are not born with emotion. This is huge news. Everybody thinks we're born with emotion. We are not born with emotion. We're born with something else called affect, which we'll get to in a second. Emotions are created by us at about 18 months of age as the emotional centers of our brain, primarily the limbic regions in the center of the brain, become mature and they start to come online. And now we start to learn how to create emotions. And so that's number one. We're not born with emotions. We learn to create them starting at about the time we start to verbalize. Huge, huge difference in the way that everybody thinks about emotions. Number two, emotions are culturally created. And what this means is that emotions that we might have here in the United States or North America will not exist in Finland, or will not exist in Slovakia, or will not exist in the thousands of Asian cultures. Every culture has its own definition of what emotion is and how it works. Now, all emotions, no matter how culturally created, no matter where in the world they are based on something that we are born with, which is called affect, A-F-F-E-C-T. Affect is the sense of pleasantness or unpleasantness that we experience all the time, 24/7. Depending upon who you talk to, there are as few as 2 or 3 affect and as many as 9 affect. I happen to use the 9 affect model developed by psychologist Sylvan Tompkins. You can Google Tompkins, Tompkins, and he's no longer alive. He did most of his work in the 60s and 70s. The reason that I follow his work is, first of all, it's a very rich model. And more importantly, neuroscientists are following his early work to help them understand how emotions are created in the brain. So we're going to talk about these 9 affect. As I said, affect is the general sense of feeling that we experience throughout the day. And the way the process works, to describe a very complex process very simply, is we engage in interoception. That means that we are being aware of what's going on in our bodies, what we feel. That's what we would call feeling. It's something going on physically. That triggers an affect in our brain, in one of our brain centers. And there are 9 different affects that get triggered in neural networks. And then we take that affect, and if we are emotionally self-aware, we create emotions from that affective experience. And all of a sudden now we are able to describe our emotions. That is how an emotionally self-aware, emotionally intelligent person works. Unfortunately, because we are all emotionally invalidated as children, we never develop strong emotional content. We are not able to categorize, as I'll talk about in a moment. And you'll see the problems that creates. So affect has 2 components. One is valence, which means it's either positive, neutral, or negative. And the other is arousal. It's either a high intensity, low intensity, or medium intensity arousal. So now you've got 9 affects, 2 different attributes to these affects. Each attribute has 3 aspects. And you can think about it this way. Think about an artist's palette where you have primary colors. And the skilled artist can take those colors and put them together in various combinations to make an infinite number of other tones and colors and shades. That's what our brain does in creating emotion. We take affect and we turn it into emotion through a process known as emotional categorization. So the 9 affects are positive, neutral, and negative. The 2 positive affects are excitement and happiness, joy. The neutral affect, only one, surprise, startle. It can be surprise at a birthday party, or it can be surprise because you almost stepped on a rattlesnake, which live where I live. We coexist. And then you have the negative affects: fear, terror, distress, anguish, anger, rage, disgust, dismell, it's the smell of spoiled milk, and shame, humiliation. Out of these 9 affects, we create all of our emotions. And of course, they're culturally created. So if you live in Central Eastern Europe, you're going to create different emotions that somebody will create in Siberia, for example. It's all it's all local. And so culture defines how we describe these different kinds of combinations of affective experience. So affect is information. It creates perceptions about our environment because we're having a physical sensation and perception about, is this good or is this bad? Do I approach or do I defend? It creates our reality. Without affect, we wouldn't have a reality because we wouldn't be able to know what we've got in front of us. We couldn't react to it. All animals have some form of affect. Even, I mean, you could even say even a unicellular creature like bacteria actually have a form of affect because they can either approach or avoid in their environments. Approach maybe to gather food, or avoid because of a noxious substance that they're trying to stay away from or from a predator. So affect is a universal experience of life in terms of what we have. So it's essential to life. Without it, we could no life could exist. And affect, of course, controls our behavior. And it drives our decision making. All of our decision making is emotional. All of it. There is no such thing as rational decision making. You can rationalize, you can make an emotional decision and then think through whether or not that's the right decision or not. So rationalization provides, and reasoning provides us a means of making better decisions or explaining to other people why we made the decision we made. But that is not our default mode for making decisions. It's all basically affective or emotional. As I said, all emotion is based on affect. And that gets us to a concept known as emotional categorization. I said a moment ago that one of the things that we have to do at about 18 months of age is start creating emotions in our brain. It's the constructed theory of emotion that Feldman Barrett has developed. And this starts with the idea that we are going to create a database of words in our native language that associate with different affective states. So, for example, we could take anger and we could say, all right, frustration is a form of anger. It's mild. It can be a relatively mild arousal, and it can be a medium to unpleasant. I suppose it could be highly unpleasant as well. Form of being denied something that you wish, and that's a form. It's in the anger category, and so that would be the emotion of anger. We learn how to categorize this affective experience we're having with a specific word that describes that feeling. Now, this is very powerful, and it turns out that human beings are the only species on the planet that can do this. Not even the great apes can do this, or the primates. People think that dogs have emotion or cats have emotion. They don't. They have affect. We're watching their affective experience. But here's why. When we are able to emotionally categorize, we're able to transform that core affective experience into an intentional state. We concretize the affect into an emotion that comes into our consciousness, and we can say, I am angry. Then the next thing we can do is, once we say, I'm angry, why am I angry? I can look around and say, what is causing me to be angry? So I can start drawing inferences about what caused the affective change. The third thing I can do is I can decide what to do next. It informs me of what's going on, and now I can make a decision around this emotion. And finally, and most importantly, it allows me to communicate what I'm experiencing to somebody else. I'm really pissed off. No other animals other than humans can do this. And so emotions become critical from translating affective experience, which is primarily unconscious, it's outside of our conscious control, into a conscious experience that we can do something with. Now, of course, if we're not able to emotionally categorize, then we've got real problems, because we are now left with the reactive programming that we had as children, and that's the best we can possibly do in terms of how we behave when we're angry or upset. And this leads to a lot of problems. So once we start developing emotional categorization, we start building this emotional database. As we mature throughout life, we ideally want to develop emotional granularity. And that just means that we have a broader vocabulary of emotional experience to describe ever more refined affective experiences. So this is the ability to express emotional experiences with precision. And it works like this. So we have low granularity on the left, high granularity on the right. We have a negative affect, and let's just say it's anger. Now we can start subdividing that anger into many, many subcategories. And the more we subdivide it, and the more refined our ability to describe what we're feeling is, the more emotional granularity we have. So we could be frustrated, or we could be irritated, or we could be annoyed, or we could be aggravated. We could be enraged. We could hate somebody. All of these are different types of anger and different types of affective experience within the anger category. And the idea is to develop as much granularity as you can. A lot of people wonder, well, why do we spend money on arts and literature and dance and theater and school and music? And the reason, although most people aren't aware of this, that those are critical studies for children is because they're all emotional experiences. And they allow children to have emotional experiences that help them to develop this emotional granularity, because emotional granularity is not happening at home. Most parents do not want their children to express negative emotions. Most parents will not tolerate anger. They will not tolerate rage from a child or a tantrum. They are not patient with it. They will shut it down because it creates too much anxiety for themselves. And they just know how to handle it, and they just do what their parents did. And kids are sent away from the dinner table because they're expressing their normal emotions, because parents don't know how to de-escalate an angry child. And of course, it's abusive. There's a study out of the Kaiser Foundation in San Diego County called the ACEs study. ACEs like the Ace of Hearts. Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. If you want to really see the importance of what I'm talking about, Google Adverse Childhood Experience Study and read the summaries of the study. Basically, over decades, researchers in San Diego have been tracking Kaiser patients and correlating their later life outcomes with their experiences as children. And what they found was that when children were emotionally abused, even as something as which seems as benign as emotional invalidation, later in life, they suffered from cancer, diabetes, obesity, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a whole host of life-threatening, life-killing, life-shortening diseases, all relating back to the emotional abuse they suffered as children. And all it takes is one or two ACEs. And this is not something that you recover from. And an ACE can be as simple as that little girl being told to feel differently than what she is. That is how powerful this stuff is. And the science is just damning about how we treat each other, even in the most casual ways where we don't think it's important at all. So that gets us to a condition called alexithymia, which means the inability to be aware of and state what you are experiencing emotionally. I'm interested in alexithymia because as a peacemaker, I have to walk into very intense conflicts where people are so angry that they would rather shoot each other with an AK-47 than sit down at the table and talk. What's always interesting to me is when people are at peace, they love the idea of peacemaking. But when they're at war, when they're in conflict, the last thing they want to do is have a peacemaker show up because they think it's a compromise. It's weak, it's soft, it's touchy-feely, it'll never work for me. I've heard every objection there is. And that's because they are alexithymic. They are so angry, they're literally, the emotional centers of their brain have shut down their prefrontal cortex and they can no longer think clearly. And you've experienced this and you've also seen it in other people. The studies show this, that alexithymia is the impaired ability to categorize affect into emotion. And so when people are alexithymic, they can't express emotion with any granularity. They've lost touch with their emotional database, if they have one to begin with. Decreased capacity to cope with strong emotions. Core affect is experienced somatically. That means that they're experiencing it physically in their bodies. Without emotional categorization, decision-making is impaired. In fact, you can't even make good decisions at all. Negative affect is more intensely experienced than positive affect. People with alexithymia are experiencing low emotional intelligence in the moment. There's higher reactivity and decreased empathy. And so what you see when people are emotionally upset and angry is you see all of these different aspects. They can no longer function rationally, if rationality is a way to be. So from my perspective, as a person who deals with conflict every single day and paid a lot of money to walk into conflicts to help people get them solved and restore relationships and reconcile, the foundational skill is very simple, easy to state. We can calm people down by reducing the alexithymic tendencies of people who are in deep anger. So what we need to do is help people get out of their alexithymia. And this is accomplished through the technique of affect labeling. So I'll tell you a quick story about how I discovered this, and then we'll talk a little bit about the science, and then I'll show you how to do it. So it was 2005. By the way, just by way of background, I was a trial lawyer for 22 years, won big, lost big, left the practice of law after I obtained my master's degree in peacemaking and conflict studies. So I went back to school mid-career and earned a master's degree, left the practice of law, and started becoming a peacemaker and mediator. And that all I left the practice in 2000. In 2005, I was called into a mediation in Santa Barbara, California, with a divorced couple, and they had an $18,000 problem. They'd spent $50,000 in attorney's fees. In the conference room, I couldn't get a word in edgewise because they were hurling vile insults at each other and screaming at each other. And literally, if there'd been knives on the table, there would have been blood on the floor. I mean, it was just short of violence. And I had no idea what to do. I mean, I've got a lot of training and a lot of experience, but I'd never seen anything quite like this. And the thought came to me, listen to the emotions. So that's what I did. And I had Susan, we'll call her. I asked her, Susan, please tell me what John is feeling right now. And she said, oh, he's really angry. And I said, well, tell that to John. Oh, John, you are really angry. And he said, yeah. And I had John tell his story about why he filed this lawsuit. And instead of having Susan respond to it, I asked her to simply reflect back his emotional experience. And as she did that, she moved from being a victim to being empowered. And as John was being emotionally validated, his anger disappeared and the rage went away. So I had them switch after John finished his story, and John listened to Susan's emotional experiences around what she experienced. And when it was all over with, John put his face in his hands and he started to sob uncontrollably for about 3 or 4 minutes. I mean, it was really wild. When I sat there and held space for him, he finally blew his nose and cleaned himself up and looked across the table and said, Susan, that's the first time you've listened to me in 25 years. They settled the case in 5 minutes, got up, completely ignoring me, walked out holding hands, and had lunch with each other. And my jaw hit the floor. These were people who were willing to kill each other 3 or 4 hours earlier. And now they had completely reconciled, not a bit of anger in either one of them. I knew what I'd done, but I didn't know why it worked. So I started playing with it in other conflicts, and I was getting the same basic result. And then 2 years later, in 2007, neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA published a brain scanning study that showed how affect labeling, this idea of labeling somebody's emotional experience by reflecting it back, works in the brain. And this is from the abstract. The citation is there, putting feeling into words. If you Google that, you can get a copy of the study yourself and read it. But let me translate the neurogeek for you. Affect labeling, relative to other forms of encoding, diminished, in other words, quieted down the response of the amygdala and other limbic regions to negative emotion. In other words, when somebody was told how they felt, what emotions they were experiencing, the emotional centers of the brain quieted down. They were deactivated. Additionally, affect labeling increased activity in a single brain region, the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. That's where the executive function of our behaviors resides. Finally, the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and amygdala activity during affect labeling were inversely correlated, a relationship that was mediated by activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. So what was happening was, when people were in the scanning machine, their brains were being imaged in functional magnetic resonance imaging, and their emotional experience was being validated. What would happen was that their prefrontal cortex came online, and at the same time, their emotional centers quieted down. And it happened really fast. So now here was the science to explain to me what I had done back in 2005. And so I started teaching it, and people were getting the same basic results everywhere. So this is called affect labeling. And here are the brain circuits. I'm not going to go into great detail about all of this, but this is just showing you the circuits that Lieberman found that were implicated in the idea of reflecting back emotions. So the point of all this is not that you need to become neuroscientists or even understand the science, but understand that this is not pop psychology. This is not based on old myths. This is hard science that establishes exactly why this very powerful de-escalation technique works. So how do we do it? This is how we do it. It's a 3-step process. Step number 1, you're confronted with somebody who's angry or upset. You're going to ignore the words. It's white noise. This is hard to do in the beginning because we're conditioned to pay attention to words. We think that words convey all the content, when in fact, all we're really interested in is emotional information, and words convey less than 7% of all the emotional content that people put out in their emotional data fields. So we're going to ignore the words. Number 1, we don't want to get triggered. So by ignoring the words, we will not get triggered. Number 2, we want to free up bandwidth in our brains to be able to do the next 2 steps. So number 1, ignore the words. Number 2, guess at the emotions. Now I say guess at the emotions, but really the way I teach it is to say read the emotional data fields of the upset person. Emotions are data. It's information, just like numbers on a spreadsheet. And our brains are hardwired to quickly, efficiently, and accurately read those emotions because we've only had language for 230,000 years as hominids. For millions of years before human beings and our predecessors lived in clans and groups with no language. How did they communicate? They communicated through emotional expression. And so our brains became extremely sensitive to other people's emotional states. Now, because of the myth of rationality, this innate ability we have is never developed, but it's still there. You have it. It's in there, and it's really easy to activate. All you have to do is just be quiet. Get rid of the self-talk in your head. Just be quiet, and within a second or two, the emotions that the other person is having will flow into your consciousness. So you don't have to guess at all. It's all automatic. You don't have to. It's totally effortless, and it's fast, and it's really accurate. So you're going to guess at the emotions or read the emotional data field. And as the emotions start coming into your consciousness, you're going to reflect back the emotions with a simple use statement. Now, this is a little radical too. You are not going to use an I statement. That is that old active listening crap that you all know does not work. It's, that was developed by Thomas Gordon, a psychologist in the 1960s. Didn't work then, doesn't work now, will never work in the future. And in addition, his work was completely misinterpreted by the human potential movement in the 60s and 70s. And even today, colleagues of mine are teaching mediators to use I statements. I just shake my head. I can't believe they're still teaching this old psychology that doesn't work. Same thing with nonviolent communication. That was Carl Rosenberg's work. He ended up, all of these people went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and basically it's just stealing. Nonviolent communication is just a rebranding of what Thomas Gordon did. It doesn't work either for calming angry people down. But what does work is to use a simple use statement. So I would say something like, oh, you're really angry. In fact, I'm going to affect label you all right now, and just listen and feel what happens inside of you as I validate emotions. You're really angry. You're just really pissed off. And you're really frustrated because you don't feel listened to. You don't feel appreciated. You don't feel heard. You don't feel supported. You feel like you've been treated unfairly. And you're worried and anxious and concerned. And you're a little shamed, a little embarrassed that you're feeling this way. And you're sad. And you feel some grief around this because your connection has been lost. You feel betrayed. And it hurts. You feel completely abandoned, and you feel completely unloved and unlovable. All right, now all of you presumably are not in an angry place right now, but you could, what did it feel like when I labeled those emotional experiences? Just in the chat box really quickly, put in what your experience was. Telepathic emotional imaging. It's not telepathic. It is all based on brain science, hard brain science. That's what makes this so powerful, is it's empirically based. So when do you know that you've calmed somebody down? 4 things you're going to be watching for. Number 1, this angry, upset person is going to nod their head up and down like this, or in India, they go back and forth. An affirmative head gesture saying, acknowledging. Number 2, they're going to give you a verbal response and saying something like, yeah, or exactly, or yeah, you really heard me, something like that. The third thing that's going to happen is you're going to get a dropping of the shoulders, and then there's going to be a big sigh of relief. So these are 4 unconscious, involuntary relaxation responses. When you get these responses, you have successfully calmed that angry, upset person. Usually it takes about 30 seconds, but I say 90 seconds because most people can't believe that it works so quickly. But basically what's happening here, and the reason that it works, is that you are lending your prefrontal cortex to this upset person for the 30 to 90 seconds it takes for that person's prefrontal cortex to come back online. And once it comes back online, they can calm themselves. But as long as their emotional centers are overwhelming the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, they have no control because they cannot access their emotional database. So by affect labeling, what you are doing is helping them regain access to their emotional database so they can now process their affect into emotion, assess what's going on, and they're able to self-soothe and self-calm almost immediately. This has worked in every imaginable circumstance that you can think of. In 2010, my colleague Laurel Coffer and I started the Prison of Peace Project, where we have, for the last 12 years, basically, gone into maximum security prisons around the world, our colleagues and us, training murderers to be peacemakers. And the very first skill we teach them is how to listen to emotions and reflect emotions. And we get absolutely phenomenal results. I've taught thousands and thousands of people how to do this, and it always works. Now, there are a couple of things that can happen here. So let me just kind of go through what might happen. First of all, don't do this today at home. Go out and practice it. Go out into a neutral place in a low-risk social environment and test out these ideas yourself. Here in the United States, I like to tell people to go to Starbucks, because you can walk into a Starbucks, go to the barista, place your order, give them your credit card, and you can say something like, oh, you're really happy today, because it works with positive emotions as well as negative. And watch what happens. And invariably, the barista will just light up because you validated that barista, probably the first person all day that really recognized that barista. I call this listening others into existence. You are learning how to listen others into existence. So you start with a barista, start with a restaurant server. If you want the best service you'll ever get in your life in a restaurant, affect label the server. Practice this for a few weeks and observe in these low-risk social situations how this really works. Then you can start testing it a little closer to home. In the beginning, it's kludgy and awkward and feels really weird to be telling somebody how they're feeling. It flies in the face of everything we think we know about listening. So that's why you have to start slow and practice, so you can convince yourself that it really works. And the beauty about this practice is it's self-affirming. The more you do it, the more you want to do it, because you see the gratitude that people express to you when you've literally listened them into existence. A couple of situations that sometimes people confront. One question that people raise is, well, what if I'm wrong? Well, you're almost never wrong because your brain is so good at doing this. But if you are wrong, what you're going to experience is this upset person is going to correct you. So you could say something, oh man, you are really angry. No, I'm not. I'm really frustrated. Oh, you're really frustrated. And then I'll say, you're really frustrated and upset and you feel betrayed and you're really nervous. Yeah. And you're really pissed off. You're really angry. Yeah, I'm really angry. So why is it the first time they said they're not angry and the second time they said they were? It's because you gave them back their prefrontal cortex and now they could recognize they were angry. So if they challenge you, they're probably wrong and you're probably right. So you aren't wrong. They just are alexithymic and they don't know what they're feeling. So just cycle back, repeat back whatever emotion they give you, repeat it back, keep working with them, and then cycle back, and you'll get it. So that happens. Not often, but it happens. Another thing to watch out for is what happens when you get pushback. So somebody will say something like, "Who the hell do you think you are, my psychotherapist?" Or "Stop doing that to me. Stop doing that stuff to me, that affect stuff." And you'll get pushback. All right. What that means is you did it too well. You were too good, because what happens is when you affect label, you penetrate that wall I talked about earlier. You're going right through the wall like a superhero, and you are right inside that very sacred, intimate space where most people will never let another human being into. And you're seeing this human being with all the warts and what they think are horrible things. Of course, none of it's true, but we all are programmed to think this. And you're right there in the raw emotional experience, and it scares the crap out of them. So what you do is you back out and you give it a rest and come back 5 or 10 minutes later, and then you affect label but conversation. Oh, frustrating. You're really frustrated. Don't say another word. Just let it go. Typically, if you get pushed back, it's because you were too pushy, you weren't subtle enough, and you scared somebody. So just recognize the pushback is not about you doing anything wrong. It's about you doing it too well and really skiing you. No I statements. Don't say, "I see you, I feel you," or "what I think you're feeling is anger." None of that. The moment you use an I statement, you're no longer listening from the speaker's frame of reference. It took a long time to figure this out. So the only reason that people use I statements when they're listening is because they're self-soothing. Because it's passive voice, it's language of disconnection. They can detach themselves from their own anxiety and they self-soothe themselves, but they're not listening to the speaker. The only thing that works is a direct you statement. You are angry. You feel angry. You feel frustrated. You have to be direct. And this is, again, something that takes training, but you have to learn how to reflect emotions as they come up. So you might be interrupting somebody. It seems like you're interrupting as you're labeling their emotions. However, they don't feel interrupted. They feel deeply validated. And this is counterintuitive to everything that you think you've learned about listening. You never ask a question. Great. No, you would not say, "Are you angry?" No, they're alexithymic. If you ask them a question that they can't answer, they're only going to get more frustrated and angry because they can't tap into their emotional database. So never ask a question. Just simply reflect back their emotion with a simple you statement. Don't use passive voice. "It is clear that you are angry." No, you're using passive voice. It's voice of disconnection. You are angry. You're going to use passive voice because you're afraid that you're going to look stupid or that you're going to be rude or manipulative or smarmy or patronizing. You're more worried about yourself than you are worried about calming the other person down. Get over it. Learn to manage your own anxiety and just directly tell people what they feel. It takes practice. This is not something that just happens overnight, but it doesn't take years either. Take a couple of weeks of practice and you'll have it nailed. It's really, really not that difficult. Okay, so I want to wrap it up. We've been going now for almost an hour. And this link, dougnoll.co.bigview, takes you to a page on my website. And on that page, obviously it's not trained to my website, which has got a ton of resources. But on this particular page, there's a free ebook that kind of recapitulates everything that I've talked about today. You can buy my fourth book, De-Escalate, How to Calm an Angry Person in 90 Seconds or Less. You can buy one of my video courses, How to De-Escalate. And if you really want to invest in yourself, you can take my Developing Emotional Competency online course, all of which are available on this particular webpage, https://dougnoll.co/bigview. The website is dougnoll.com. but I use this link so that I can create a special page all for you. All right, so I am done. I'm willing to take a few questions for a few minutes. We can go for another 3 or 4 minutes. So if you have questions, put them in the chat and I will answer them as completely as I can with the time that we have remaining. Do you offer certifications? Yes. Answer: 4 levels of certification. Number 1, you learn how to do it so you master the skill. Number 2, you learn how to facilitate using the online video courses so you can bring groups together. Number 3, you can learn how to train people to do this live. And number 4, you can train trainers. So yes, 4 levels of certification. And the higher up you get, the more you got to learn, obviously. There's a lot to this. There's a lot behind all of this, as you can probably gather. And this is just an introductory talk. Any other questions? Okay, I know this is counterintuitive and counternormative and seems pretty weird and pretty strange. It goes against everything that you've ever been taught about listening. But it's the only thing that I found in 40 plus years of professional practice that works. I wouldn't use it if it didn't work. I wouldn't teach it if it didn't work. If active listening worked, I wouldn't even be here talking to you. If nonviolent communication worked, I wouldn't be here talking to you. We would be using those skills. They don't work. This works. So if you want to learn the foundational skill of life and change everything about your life and the life of people around you, transform your world one person at a time, learn how to listen other people into existence. And I guarantee you, your life will be so much happier, you won't believe it. And all those problems, relationship problems you have, they'll go away. You'll never have another fight or argument again in any important relationship. Okay, Bruno, I think we can probably call it quits. I don't see any other questions coming up.
Yeah, it was great to have you today, Doug. Thank you for this great workshop. Hope to have you really soon back here with us. And that's it, guys. If you have any specific question, I sent the link from the Doug website. Also, it's here on the video. And that's it. Hope to see you guys soon. Bye-bye. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, everybody, for attending.